Back when Bleach was coming out every single week, way back in the Arrancar arc and the Fate Karakura Town era, I think the Bankai that I was most curious about that we hadn't seen yet was that of the head captain Yamamoto Shigekuni Genryusai. Now I say most curious because Yamamoto was never my favourite character. His Bankai, although certainly intriguing, was not the one I was most excited about. I was more excited to find out Bankai for characters like Kyoraku and Urahara than I was for Yamamoto. But I say curious because of all the Zanpakuto we'd ever seen in the series, Ryujin Jaka was always the one that I really struggled to even visualise what a Bankai for this could even be. And the reason for that is because his Shikai was almost as powerful as basically every other Bankai we'd seen in the series anyway. Abilities like Enetsu Jigoku and Jokaku Enjo were such visual spectacles that I really had trouble imagining what a Bankai for Yama could be that could possibly do justice to this Shikai, which really was just an absolute spectacle of power on display every time we saw it. And that's not to say that fans didn't try and come up with something for the head captain before it was revealed. I remember seeing numerous theories abound online, things like Yamamoto would bring in the power of the sun or bring the power of the sun down itself, or even create some kind of enormous phoenix akin to the Sokyoku. Little did we know, of course, that those theories about the sun would actually turn out to be somewhat in the vein of truth. But regardless, I think people were very interested to see what Yamamoto's Bankai actually would be after witnessing him using his Shikai every so often and it blowing people away every time he did. To be honest, at some points I wondered if we'd even ever get a Bankai for this character, just because his power was already so off the charts, and I really did wonder if Kubo could ever even do him justice with a Bankai. So when the Thousand Year Blood War arc began, and from the off it looked like the past of the Gotei 13 might actually play a big role, and the older captains, including Yamamoto, might be more pivotal to the plot and the character development, I thought, okay, we might actually get a Bankai for this character, especially it started ramping up when we got all the stuff about Chojiro, we got his Bankai. Little did I know that we'd actually get Yamamoto's Bankai within almost the first 20-25 chapters of the arc. In this video, I'm just going to go over Zanka no Tachi, Yamamoto's long-awaited Bankai, see what it can do, see how it looks, and see whether or not we think it did justice to the old man and his incredibly powerful Zanpakuto Ryujin Jaka. Before we begin, guys, we're still on the way to 40,000 subs. I think there's less than 500 subs to go now, or something like that. So if we can hit that before the end of the year, I would really, really appreciate it. So hit that button now. You're in the perfect place for Bleach content every single week. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up as well. It really helps on the YouTube algorithm, and hit the notification bell to stay up to date with all of my videos. So yeah, towards the end of the very first invasion of the Vandenreich, the really awesome string of chapters that Kubo did at the start of the Thousand Year Blood War arc, we finally got it. Yamamoto's Bankai, the unthinkable, most powerful of powerful Zanpakuto abilities, Zanka no Tachi. I will admit to being a little bit disappointed that it didn't have any kind of Ryujin Jaka resemblance in its name, but Zanka no Tachi is pretty cool nonetheless. What was more immediately apparent and interesting, however, was how the Bankai initially looked. Yamamoto activates his Bankai at the end of chapter 506 when he faces off against who he believes to be Yhwach in a rematch 1,000 years in the making. I will admit to my excitement being somewhat clouded over in this chapter a little bit. Mere pages before saying Bankai, I thought that Yamamoto had just killed As Not for good, and I was a little bit disappointed by that, considering he got taken out in a single hit by the guy Shikai. That's nothing too surprising, but I did think he was dead. So I was a little bit like, oh, and then he did his Bankai at the end, and I was like, okay, that's kind of redeemed it. The actual panel where he says Bankai is incredible, and actually that's something I want to bring up briefly as well, is that Yamamoto has always been a character that Kubo has really flexed his drawing muscles with. Every time we see his Shikai Ryujin Jaka, it's always a double-page spectacle. Then, you know, there's just amazing things going on every time he does it. Abilities, like I said earlier, Enetsu Jigoku, look absolutely incredible in the manga. So to see his Bankai on display was always going to be a work of art, but it's actually surprisingly subdued. So what happens is when he says Bankai Zanka no Tachi, his flames actually disappear, they just disperse, and you know, of course, that his Shikai gives off flames constantly like a stream of power, but here they vanish, leaving behind nothing but a charred blade with a single strand of smoke coming off it. It's actually a really cool visual, in my opinion, and it really helps give off the impression that Yamamoto is this truly aged warrior who has been through a lot, and his Zanpakuto has seen just as many battles. My immediate first thought was, actually, this reminds me of Ichigo's Tensa Zangetsu, condensing his power instead of blowing it outwards like most Bankais actually are, and I thought that was really cool. And actually, Kubo would then repeat that resemblance with Kenpachi's Bankai later on down the line. And I think all three of these characters are actually very similar in the way their Reiatsu is just so monstrous compared to just about everyone else. And I really enjoy that. And I like that trifecta of characters whose Bankai seem to collapse in on themselves instead of actually billowing outwards. So we've got Yamamoto's Bankai here on show now, and it is just this dried up, shriveled old sword giving off some smoke. Definitely not really what anyone expected, but Kubo is one for subverting expectations, often in the best way possible. Before we begin actually seeing what Yamamoto can do, however, what was really cool about this Bankai was the way Kubo used it to set the tone of the battle immediately, and I think it's a fantastic visual way of showing us just how much power Yamamoto's Bankai actually has. The mere act of activating this Bankai has repercussions for the entirety of Soul Society, and I love that. It's such a great way of just showing how awe-inspiring Yamamoto's power actually is without actually saying it. It's a great method of showing, not telling, and I love the fact that the sheer heat coming off of his Bankai causes Ukitake's throat to dry up, Shunsui's lips to crack, and then Unohana watches as this vase just empties of its water because of the heat in the air. And I think that's a really, really nice way of setting the tone for the battle. And I really hope that the anime kind of creates this sense of foreboding with that, because it is it's like a slow burn, apologies for the pun, but it is kind of building to Yamamoto's Bankai. You also get to see it actually shut down Hitsugaya's Bankai just by activating, again showcasing the difference in power between these characters. Kang-Do is trying to use the stolen Daiguren Hyorin Maru, but now that Zanka no Tachi has been activated, it just instantly begins to melt, and that's a really, really cool little detail. Despite all this heat, however, there's actually no flames on display, and it's definitely an interesting way to kick things off. But Yamamoto attempts to attack what he believes to be Yuha, and basically Yuha's trying to discern exactly what's going on here, because when they fought 1,000 years ago, Yamamoto used Zanka no Tachi back then, and it was just this sword that produced immeasurable amounts of flame with every swing. We get a brief glimpse of a flashback panel of Captain Yamamoto using it 1,000 years ago. But now things have changed, and I really like that because it shows that even as old as Yamamoto was back then, he still was mastering his Bankai and harnessing it and changing it and making it even more powerful than it was back then. So I love the fact that his Bankai did still evolve even from that point. It shows you that, you know, it doesn't matter how powerful you are, there's still stuff you can learn. And Yamamoto even says that to Yuha. He says, like, you know, is my Bankai really the same as it was 1,000 years ago? Feel the effects with your body. Now, Yamamoto's Bankai has 4 different abilities, and it's nice and simple. They're all named after points of the compass, and the first one he uses is Zanka no Tachi East Kyoku Jitsujin. And this is a really cool ability. Basically, this is where all of the flames, every single flame of Ryujin Jaka is concentrated on the edge of Zanka no Tachi's blade. It doesn't produce any flame, and it doesn't burn anything either, but simply the raw power of this sword's edge will cause anything it comes into contact with to just disappear from existence. And this is the sort of thing that I think many of us actually kind of imagined Yamamoto would do, but never seriously. Like, it's the sort of jokey ability where if you hit someone, they just are erased from existence because he's so powerful, but that's quite literally what Kyoku Jitsujin was doing. There's an interesting panel where Kubo tries to depict this, and I remember thinking I had no idea what was going on in this panel, but Yuha and Yama are sort of silhouetted, and Yamamoto has struck the ground, and there's a massive chasm where the floor once was, and I remember reading it and being like, what's going on in this picture? But it is easier to see now. You're kind of looking at Yama and Yuha from below, as though you're in the chasm. But that's completely absurd. It's basically anything that Yamamoto touches with this blade's edge is just completely annihilated from existence, and it doesn't really get more powerful than that. Now, of course, Yamamoto is not done. His Bankai really does encompass absolutely everything it needs to, and Yhwach basically says that, oh, okay, that's an incredibly powerful ability, but as long as I don't get hit by it, I can still fight you. So what we've got with Kyokujitsujin is the ultimate offense. But of course, as Yamamoto says, as there's an east, there must be a west, and we are introduced to the perfect defense as well, Zanjitsu Gokui. And basically Yamamoto is enveloped in flames, and this ability is actually active from the moment he uses his Bankai. He can just choose to make it visible or not. So the fires are all around him, and as Yhwach tries to attack him, his sword is just erased from existence. There's a theme here. And basically Yamamoto reveals that, yeah, he is shrouded in this cloak of fire. Now, what's cool about the cloak of fire is that it's not actually flames, it is Reiatsu leaking off of him, giving him the impression of being covered in fire, as noted by Hashwolf. But what's really cool about that little visual flourish is that you can see him almost like breathing fire. The fire is coming off of his eyebrows, off of his moustache, his beard, coming out of his mouth. He has become the flame itself because it is just his Reiatsu leaking off of him. But again, the visuals with this Bankai were really, really on point. But what I really like about this Bankai so far is that it's not completely crazy visually. It's actually quite neat. You've got this sword that's all decayed and dried up, but with an incredibly strong edge. And Yamamoto himself is just like wearing a cloak of fire. But that's really it so far. It's nothing crazy, but it is the perfect offense and the perfect defense. So Yamamoto reveals West. He's obliterated Yhwach's blade. And he basically says that he's now cloaked in something as hot as the sun itself. So Yhwach is now facing almost the physical embodiment of the sun, validating what I feel like was quite a few fan theories way back in the day. Now, I really like Zanjitsu Gokui. I think it's drawn incredibly. All of this Bankai is drawn incredibly. Kubo was really just doing some crazy stuff artistically with this one. But that actual panel where he reveals his fire cloak, I think is phenomenally good. It looks really, really cool. And actually him enveloping himself in fire is kind of what I always imagined for his Bankai. Obviously not exactly like this, but I did kind of envision him looking a bit similar to that. So Kubo really kind of delivered on that front as far as I'm concerned. But the best was absolutely yet to come with this Bankai. There's an east and a west, so you can rightly assume that there is a south and a north, and south is the next one we get to see. Kaka Jumanakushi Dai Sojin is the name of this ability, and it's pretty much one of the most bonkers powers I've ever seen in Bleach, but at the same time it so perfectly encapsulates Yamamoto being the leader of the gods of death. He can resurrect the dead. By plunging his blade into the ground, he heats up the charred remains of these skeletons, essentially, and they burst out of the ground, and Yamamoto says that he will give them one more chance at battle. Now, again, as I've said already, the visuals in this Bankai are off the charts, and this is absolutely no exception, and it looks amazing when these just, ash black skeletons rise up out of the ground, and Yamamoto is there with his fire cloak commanding this army of the dead. I love it, and I love it, and I love it because it is a twisted version of being a Shinigami. He's supposed to kind of like guide these souls to the afterlife, and especially as the leader of the Shinigami as well, he really should be the embodiment of a god of death. But here he is controlling the dead and leading them into battle, and I absolutely think that is phenomenal. But Kubo wasn't done with this ability, and there is one extra kick in the teeth for the fake Yhwach, and that is the skeletons could have just been a cool little visual trick. It could have just been this awesome idea that Yamamoto raises the dead, then they're nothing in particular, they're just like Reiatsu skeletons. But oh no, they're actually the skeletons of Yamamoto's past victims. They are people that Yamamoto has killed, I would presume with his Bankai. It could just be Ryujin Jaka in general, but they are the skeletons of people he has actually killed in the past, heated up and like rejuvenated into life now to fight for Yamamoto himself, which, you know, is a really cruel twist on the idea of being a Shinigami, and it's just really, really clever, which is something that Yuha Bark points out himself. You bring shame to the Shinigami, he says, because of the way he's using the dead like this. And what I always wonder as well is because obviously a lot of the dead that we see here, we find out that Yamamoto is using some of Yuha Bark's own men against him. Zeedritz, Hubert, who we actually find out was the original vice captain of the Sternritters, and Argola. Now, because these guys were Quincy back in the day, that means they were probably humans. So that means that when they were killed by Yamamoto, did they ever get a chance to move on? Or has he essentially trapped their souls in some kind of purgatory until the day he uses his Bankai, which is crazy to think about and actually really quite dark. But I do love this idea that Yamamoto is the history of Soul Society, and he literally embodies that in his Bankai, and he just brings it to life to fight for him as like some last-ditch effort. I think it's incredibly creative and just really, really cool. I think it would have already been really cool if it was just raising the dead, but the fact that it's actually people that Yamamoto has killed himself and seemingly imprisoned within the fires of his sword, I love that. I think that's really smart. So Yamamoto has raised the dead against Yuha Bark, and now all of these skeletons are kind of just like holding on to him. They're not really doing much, but they are kind of holding him back a little bit. But it gives Yamamoto a chance to use his final ability, which is, of course, Zanken no Tachi North Tenchi Kaijin. I'll admit to being a little bit disappointed by Tenchi Kaijin. So far we had been building up the abilities. We had Kyoku Jitsujin, which visually wasn't necessarily anything too crazy, although I will admit, in Bleach Brave Souls, Kyoku Jitsujin looks really, really nice actually, with these searing hot lines of fire on the ground, supposedly indicating where he's erased things from existence. Next we have Zanjitsu Gokui, which of course looks incredible, but of course it's nothing compared to Kaka Jumanakushi Dai Sojin, where he raises the dead. So maybe I was getting myself hyped, unjustly for North, but I was thinking like, if you're leaving North until the end, maybe it's going to be something absolutely mind-blowing. This is when people were speculating maybe he was going to bring down the sun, like something like that, or like a meteorite, which happened anyway later on in the series, but something from the sky. I remember that was the main theory. It was something from up above, being North, but actually it turned out to just be one hell of a sword swing. And don't get me wrong, it's still drawn incredible. That double-page spread of Yamamoto swinging his blade with the Japanese symbols behind him looks incredible. But it is just a sword swing at the end of the day, which is a little bit disappointing. It's got some range on it, as Yuha Bark is quite far away when he falls to the ground, so it's almost maybe like a Getsuga Tensho style attack. But again, it seems to erase what it touches from existence. So that is definitely a recurring theme with Yamamoto's Bankai. And that is pretty much it. Once he thinks he's killed Yuha Bark, he releases his Bankai, and we actually get to see the process of that happening. The Zanpakuto itself, that was once rusted, actually changes back to being a sleek-looking blade, which is a nice little touch, and Yamamoto's flames leave his body. And interestingly, leave him looking very dishevelled as well, and clearly quite tired as well. The Bankai, I imagine, takes a pretty immeasurable toll. And what's also crazy about the Bankai is you have to consider the toll it does take on Yamamoto, when Unohana even mentions earlier on in the fight that if Yamamoto stays in this form for too long, he risks annihilating Soul Society itself. And again, I think that is drawn up really nicely when he first uses the Bankai. And everyone experiences the effects of it, regardless of whether they're anywhere near Yamamoto. It just has this passive ability where it heats up everything to such an enormous degree. And the fact that it would eventually destroy Soul Society is definitely an interesting burden to bear. We don't get to find out too much of what Yamamoto thinks of his own Bankai. I imagine he is fairly proud of it. He's quite a prideful individual anyway. But it is interesting, we get a brief flashback with him and Kyoraku when Kyoraku was a tiny little kid. And there's this portrait of Yamamoto shrouded in flame on his wall, but he considers it a almost like demon that was let loose on the Soul Society 1,000 years ago and just caused almost untold destruction. So it seems to me, at least anyway, and this really is just raw speculation, but I assume that Yamamoto chooses not to use his Bankai because he is afraid of the damage he'll cause around him. Because it's not like... It's similar to Kyoraku's in that Kyoraku doesn't want to get people caught in the AoE range of his Bankai, but the range is probably nothing like Yamamoto's. Like, Yamamoto's affects the entire of Soul Society and threatens to destroy it completely if left unchecked for too long. So, feels like one of these things to me where Yamamoto makes a conscious decision to use his Bankai in a situation that he believes really calls for instant and immediate eradication, and then he removes it as fast as he can, basically, which I think makes a lot of sense. So that is how his Bankai works. That's everything it can do. It is the ultimate offense with Kyoku Jitsujin, the ultimate defense with Zanjitsu Gokui, which immediately is a really cool pairing, but then it has the added spice of raising the dead, and then North, which kind of just caps it all off with a great sword swing. And I think visually it was incredible, giving this idea that Yamamoto is a living, breathing flame. So I guess I'll circle back round to the question I posed at the start of this video, really, which was, did Kubo do justice to Ryujin Jaka, essentially the most powerful and unbelievable Zanpakuto we'd ever seen? And I think he did, and I think it was a really tall order as well. I honestly, like I said, a part of me expected maybe we wouldn't even get a Bankai because of how ridiculous that Zanpakuto actually was, but I think he did, and I think he did an interesting job of it as well, because Ryujin Jaka, visually anyway, his Bankai is not the craziest we've ever seen. You know, I think there are definitely Bankai that are a bit more insane than that. I think Ryujin Jaka is surprisingly subdued, but I think it's more effective because of it. It's a bit like Ichigo's, but then it has additional layers to it, which I really like. And then he does kind of go crazy with the Army of the Dead, but regardless, I like how Yamamoto's own power is mostly kept tightly wound around him. I think it's really good. So I think for the most part, Kubo absolutely knocked it out of the park with Zanka no Tachi. I was disappointed that he wasn't actually fighting Yhwach. I think that would have been more powerful and just more effective in the story in general. But I will say that I loved Zanka no Tachi. I thought it was a phenomenally well done Bankai. Definitely one of the highlights of the final arc, and the fact that Yhwach stole it and then never used it was always really, really weird to me. I definitely thought we would see it again in the future. To be honest, I would have probably preferred he did that instead of use the Almighty, but that's definitely a discussion for another time. But yeah, let me know in the comments below, guys. It's always quite easy to come up with a question for these Bankai videos. Did you like Zanka no Tachi? Were you happy with what Kubo gave the head captain? Honestly, I was really grateful to see it at all. The fact that it all came together as nicely as it did was a bonus in my eyes. But yeah, let me know in the comments below what you thought of Zanka no Tachi. Is it your favourite Bankai? Was it your favourite moment of the final arc? Which Bankai do you prefer? And of course, do you think it's the strongest Bankai? I really do think it's very difficult to combat Zanka no Tachi because it is the ultimate offense and defense. It does have this habit of eradicating things from existence. So let me know what you think in the comments below. But until next time, guys, I'll catch you later. See you then.